Yeah, let me just,
So,
Is that Phil Crookshanks I see joining?
great.
Doesn't hear me yet.
is,
So,
Phil?
yeah, John?
Jane and Jerry, how's the audio sound on my end? Is it okay?
Sounds great to me.
Okay, good, good. That's all I need to know.
Okay. Yeah. Phil, how are you doing? Phil's connecting to audio, but I did want to tell you, John, that there was an article today about the Canadian forests, and that actually since around 2000, they have been a negative sink. They have been giving off more carbon dioxide than they've been taking in, and now, of course,
Really? Huh.
since 2000, and it's largely to do with deforestation. They were not replanting. They did a trade
Ah,
around 2000, and they weren't replanting, so the reforestation rate went down. And then, of course, then they talked about also the fires, and they named how many billion tons of CO2 that were put in the air. There's over 1,000 fires, as you know, right now in Canada. It's very scary. And
yeah. Did they factor in these forest fires now in Canada? How they're,
well, they just talked about up until just the last year or 2 years about the fires. So, and then they talked sort of separately about when the fires became much greater in the last 2 years, and also drought. So
drought?
Vancouver has a drought, and there was an article about that. I don't know if that was BBC or New York Times, and so they're all no more watering the grass. No more
Okay.
grass. Anyways, that was the beginning of the story. Boy, I would just like, wouldn't that be beautiful? Only if we could. Phil, are you unmuted? Can't hear you.
Think I am now.
Oh, how are you doing?
Today, I had a big celebration. This was my 36th day of radiation, my last day. So I made them give me tickets for a pony ride and a six-pack of beer.
Did you get to ring the bell? Did you get to ring the bell?
They don't have a bell there. It's a cheap place. Told me I had to go down the road to, I don't know, a hamburger stand or something.
Well, congratulations.
That is wonderful, Phil. Good to see you.
Yes.
Dave Cottrell, how are you doing? Dave's also on the Southeast Michigan group.
Yeah, I'm good. Knocking a lot of doors, canvassing.
Me too. Yeah, we have a pretty exciting election coming up for Warren, and I'll be knocking on doors as much as I can. Which reminds me, we have our next presentation will be the legislative update, getting us ready for the November 7th election. So, okay. Anyway, I guess I'm going to get going because I do have a couple of announcements. And just to clarify again what I just said, next month on the first Thursday, we're going to have Christy McGilvery and Tim Menotis with the legislative update that will lead us into the November 7th election, which is a very important one. Also, I had a chance to meet the new 7th executive director from the Sierra Club on Tuesday. So I wanted all you Sierra Club members to know that that we have a new executive director, and in fact, he's doing a great job of reorganization, which is going to streamline everything, help with the financial situation, along with communication. His name is Ben Jealous, and He served in roles for organizer and investigative journalist to the president of two of the nation's most influential groups pursuing equity and justice and protecting democracy. And I promise not much more, a couple more paragraphs. Ben has served on the board of directors of the Environmental Defense Fund, the Trust for Public Lands, and the Wilderness Society. He has taught at Princeton University and currently teaches at the University of Pennsylvania. Bennett is a New York Times best-selling author. His next book, Never Forget Our People Were Always Free, A Parable of American Healing, will be released in January 2023. So he's taking a national tour to meet with the various groups and the new regions. I think we're divided into about 5 regions now. So got a chance to sit next to him on Tuesday. How about that? Also, I'm giving some talks myself, and that is through MORE. So it's through the what is that called? MORE is short for Macomb Organization for Retiree Enrichment. And I have one on October 11th, and then again on October 16th. And it's a very exciting title. It says Climate Change in You Part 1 and Climate Change in You Part 2. Now, doesn't that really get you going, boy, those titles? So you'd be able to join that if you want. I guess it looks like we can start the other starter speaker here. Does anybody have anything that they'd like to tell us here at all? Rhonda, I see you. Do you want to say a few words? Tell us what you're working on.
Hi, everyone. I'm retired, so I'm trying not to work on anything.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. So, you know,
And
I work with the Just Transition team, and I work very closely with the CDC. That's the Tri-City area, Reverend Hill's Church, and the Eden Park project.
That sounds great. And what does that project do?
They're gonna transform the property of the old Mark Twain School into one of the most amazing green spaces, open for children, adults, people with Alzheimer's. There's going to be a dedicated portion of it for that. It's going to be multi-purposeful, and I think it's going to be one of the most major projects to come up in the downriver area, or at least in the Tri-City area.
Oh, wow, that sounds great.
Mhm.
Well, yeah. Okay, I'm going to introduce our speaker for today, and that's John Hartig, and the topic will be Rouge River Revived, how people are bringing their river back to life, and that's based on John's own book that's available through the University of Michigan Press. Dr. John Hartig is currently a visiting scholar at the Great Lakes Institute for Environmental Research at the University of Windsor. He also serves on the board of directors of the Detroit Riverfront Conservancy and chairs the Community Foundation for Southeast Michigan's Great Lakes Way Advisory Committee. During 2017-18, Dr. Hartig served as a Fulbright Scholar at the Basile School of International Affairs in Waterloo, Ontario. For 14 years, he served as Refuge Manager for the Detroit River International Wildlife Refuge. John has received a number of awards for his work, including being recognized as a 2022 Crain's Detroit Business Notable Leader in Sustainability, the 2015 Conservationist of the Year Award from the John Muir Association, and a 2010 Green Leader by the Detroit Free Press. And I'd like to turn this over to Dr. John Hartig.
Thanks so much, Jerry. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you. Can you see the screen?
Yep.
We are good. Yeah, well, first and foremost, thank you for all you do to protect ecosystems. We need an ecosystem spring. and we need to get mobilized and do more on that. And you are Sierra Club's at the cutting edge of that. And this is a good example, the Rouge River, of a grassroots effort to do that. Let's see here. This doesn't want to. Just 1 second, it's not moving forward here. Let me reshare here, see if that'll come up right. Bear with me. It was stuck and did not want to move. Huh. It won't advance for some reason. Just 1 second. Sorry about this. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes, I can.
Yeah.
Huh. Great. Sorry about that, but I always love this picture. This picture of the Rouge. Many of you online right now know the Rouge River. That's the Ford Rouge plant in the background there, and you have a guy in a kayak and he's fly fishing on the Rouge River. Like put those two thoughts together: the Rouge River and fly fishing. But 20 and 30 years ago, that would have been unthinkable. And yet today there's some real changes that are occurring. It's no small watershed, as you know. It has 48 communities, portions of 3 counties, including much in Wayne County, and 1.4 million people in the watershed. And you see all the branches here, the lower, middle, upper, and then the main branch. And it all comes together and empties into the Detroit River, and the lower end being heavily industrialized. There's lots of industry down there, as we know. But for just nearly 100 years, it was really, the Rouge River was just an overlooked and unappreciated resource. But that is now changing because of people working together, people rediscovering the river and thinking about the river as an ecosystem. And we are all part of that ecosystem. And what we do to the ecosystem, we do to ourselves. First Nations, First Peoples knew this, and they revered the river as a source of life. And they clearly had a sense of stewardship for it. But then, the fur trade came in. The Europeans had extirpated beaver, locally extinct over much of the European continent. And the fashion demand at that time in the 1600s and 1700s and early 1800s was this, fur hats made of beaver. And so they came over to North America and started looking for it, and discovered the Great Lakes, discovered Michigan, and discovered Southeast Michigan. So we not only did they harvest lots of beaver, but then they exported them out of Detroit. So it was quite a prized animal. Then as more Europeans arrived, you know, most people think that the ribbon farms were pretty much on the Detroit River, but this is one of the early maps of the lower Rouge. And you can see the ribbon farms going into the lower Rouge, how that each farmer wanted to have access to water. Access to water was critical. So they created these long, long ribbon farms where everyone would have some access to the river. You also note on this old map the meanders in the Rouge River. You know, the lower it gets in the watershed, you know, the closer it gets to the mouth, it begins to meander. And you see this big meander here at the end before it goes into the Detroit River. Remember that for a little while later. So after the fur trade, you know, commerce, agriculture, lumbering became the basis of the next economy. This is one of the lumber mills on the Rouge River. Some great archival photos. And then in the 18th centuries, later portions of it, a series of grist mills and sawmills were established on the main forks of the river, and shipyards were built at the lower end of the Detroit River because it's access to the Detroit River and the Great Lakes. And, you know, shipbuilding. So this is a picture from World War I. And this was being built at the Ford Rouge plant. And these were eagle boats. So these 200-foot long submarine chasers that were built on the banks of the Rouge River and launched into the Rouge River. And they were the first ships ever built by mass production. And again, out of the Ford Rouge plant. And we all know that Henry Ford purchased land in Dearborn and created his estate called Fairlane, you know, and he between 1910 and 1920, he dammed the Rouge River to power not only his mansion, but all the small Ford factories, those cottage industries, to produce parts for all his assembly plants. And in total, there over time, 62 dams were built on the Rouge River. And of course, that alters substantially stream flow and hydrology. And of course, it limits certain fishes from getting up to their spawning and nursery grounds. Then in 1915, Henry Ford bought 2,000 acres along the lower Rouge and created the largest integrated manufacturing facility, automotive manufacturing facility in the world at that time, the Rouge River. It's always fascinating to look at the scale of the operation. And I ask you to remember that photo with that big meander in the river. Well, Henry Ford decided to dredge the river so he could get the big freighters in, and straightened it so it would be easy for the freighters to come up all the way, offload their goods, turn around in the turning basin and come back out. Well, he cut on the right-hand side of the screen. You see the new Rouge River mouth on the right-hand side of your screen there. And on the left-hand side of that right-hand photo is the old river mouth. And so by cutting that channel through there, it created Zug Island, which is now infamous as part of the Industrial Revolution and for its pollution. But that was just a peninsula before, and then that became an island. And by doing that, dredging the river like that so that freighters could come it reversed the flow of the old channel. So instead of water going out the northern outflow of the Rouge River, water came in there now and went out to the lower dredged out portion of the Rouge. So literally by doing all this, it became an artificial waterway. Then with a stroke of a pen, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt converted all civilian productivity to military productivity during World War II with one single purpose, and that was to win the war. And he called for the United States to become the arsenal of democracy. And who led that challenge but Detroit? Detroit and its metropolitan area. No one built more armaments, ammunition, tanks, jeeps. It was incredible what proportion of that came out of metropolitan Detroit. And the Rouge plant, that complex produced jeeps, aircraft engines, aircraft components and parts, tires, tubes, armor plate, and tractors, all for the war. So, this is now before environmental laws. So when you convert all civilian manufacturing productivity to military to win the war, there's no thought given to pollution or environmental protection. So they actually measured back then the amount of oil and petroleum products that were being discharged to the Rouge and Detroit rivers during 1946 to 48. In total, it was 5.9 million gallons of oil and petroleum products. It takes 1 gallon of oil to pollute 1 million gallons of water. That's a lot of pollution. That volume, 5.9 million gallons of oil and petroleum products, was enough to pollute the entire western basin of Lake Erie, all Michigan waters, all Ohio waters, all Ontario waters. So 1948 was a very cold winter, and unlike some of the winters we've had in recent years, the river routinely would freeze over, and there would be only a few pockets of open water. And what was in those pockets of water was oil. And so the waterfowl came down as they had done for millennia on their migration, and they landed in those pockets of oil, and 11,000 ducks and geese died in one event in 1948. A group of duck hunters from Gibraltar and Trenton and Wyandotte picked up those oil-soaked carcasses of ducks and geese, threw them in pickup trucks, drove to Lansing, Michigan. On the left-hand photo here, they started throwing them on the sidewalk. They threw them on the front steps, and they called a press conference. And basically they said, how dare you allow this to happen to the place where we're raising our families, the place we call home, the place where we're raising our children. So today, they are credited, their advocacy, their outrage over pollution is credited with starting the Industrial Pollution Control Program of Michigan. And this story is on a historical marker at the Refuge Gateway in Trenton, right near where they collected the ducks and geese. So it's just an interesting story. But we didn't learn from that, oil pollution continued, and another 12,000 and 5,400 waterfowl died in 1960 and 67 respectively. And this is a archival photo of a conservation officer from the 60s with some of those dead ducks soaked in oil. And then again, we didn't learn our lesson. And on October 9th, 1969, sparks from a settling torch that was dropped by a worker ignited oil on the Rouge River and oil-soaked debris. And here's the last remaining photo. You can see the drawbridge on the one of the drawbridges on the Rouge River there. You can see the Ford Motor Company stack, and you see a vessel in the foreground. That's the John Kendall. That was the Detroit fireboat at the time. And what the John Kendall is trying to do is contain the fire. You don't put a river on fire out. you can only contain it and not let it get bigger. So they contained it, and flames were shooting 50 feet into the air. And it took not only the John Kendall, but 10 pieces of Detroit Fire Department equipment and 65 men to contain this fire and let it burn out. A couple of days later in the Detroit Free Press, in an editorial, it says, when you have a river that burns, for crying out loud, you have troubles. It happened on Cleveland's Cuyahoga, and now it has happened on our Rouge River. But we still hadn't learned our lesson. And, you know, in 1950, Detroit's population climaxed at 1.8 million people. You can imagine we're slightly over 600,000 today. So we're about the third of the population density today that Detroit was in 1950. So people started moving out of Detroit to suburban areas with more space and within driving distance to the workplace. And one of the first watersheds they moved was the Rouge River watershed. And the sheer number of people living in the watershed and the amount of development would have unintended consequences. And one of them was so much stormwater. And I grew up in Allen Park, Michigan. So some of these photos of the concrete channel are from Allen Park. And we used to have regularly, our basements would flood, not only with stormwater, but with raw sewage. And we used to have metal shelving in our basement, and we never put anything on the bottom two levels of the shelving. And I soon found out why, because of all this, not only stormwater, but raw sewage that came in. So the solution to that was to build this over 4-mile concrete channel to move as much water. And when I say water, I mean stormwater and sewage out of the watershed as fast as possible. So let's just get it out of here and get it to the Detroit River. They weren't thinking about the consequences of this stormwater and raw sewage on the Detroit River. They just wanted it out of the Rouge. So over a 4-mile concrete channel. So this led to a tipping point, you know, this idea of a point in time where there is an urgent need to take action, and that if nothing is done, we could see irreversible harm. So watershed residents just learned that raw sewage was overwhelming the Rouge River. And some of you on the call know this firsthand, but they counted them up, and in total, there were 168 combined sewer overflow points on the Rouge River. That's so, you know, old cities like Chicago and Milwaukee and Toronto and Cleveland and Buffalo and Detroit have combined storm and sanitary sewers. So everything works well when it's not raining under normal conditions. The left-hand side of your screen, the sewage goes to the wastewater treatment plant, it gets treated, and then after proper treatment, it gets discharged to a receiving water body. But it rains. When it rains heavily, it exceeds, the stormwater exceeds the carrying capacity of this combined storm and sanitary sewer system, and raw sewage comes out in different points called combined sewer overflow points. And again, the most important thing to remember is that there were 168 of these on the Rouge River. So compounding this problem was the amount of impervious surface. You know, how much of the watershed is rooftop, roads, parking lots, sidewalks, you know, garage roofs where water can hit it and it doesn't infiltrate into the ground. It runs off and into storm sewers and into combined sewers. And it turns out that 23% of the entire Rouge River watershed was impervious surface. Ecologists look at watersheds and they say they want that number to be 10% or less. So we're 2.3 times higher than what ecologists recommend for a healthy ecosystem. So this is what it looked like in the mid 1980s. This is a portion of the concrete channel in Melvindale, Michigan. And yes, that is a carp. Even carp were dying in the lower Rouge. And that, you see all those floating things, is raw sewage there, so literally raw and partially treated sewage was overwhelming the river. And so at that point, residents of Dearborn and Melvindale, there's many places in these communities that have those small bungalows with the 1 bedroom on top and 2 small bedrooms on the bottom. And a lot of people back in the mid 80s still didn't have air conditioning. So these residents living in Melvindale and Dearborn would leave their windows open at night so you could get some breeze that came in. And they had this really, really bad odor problem. And so they started to complain and said, yeah, it's got to be Ford Motor Company, the refinery, the steel plant. It has to be one of those. And so they complained to the city and the county, and they looked into it, and they couldn't find any compelling evidence that industry was causing this odor problem. So the residents weren't satisfied. They kept speaking out. The outcry from these residents started a petition drive, and they literally collected thousands of signatures and created 2 sets of the signatures and sent one of them to Lansing, Michigan, and put it on the desk of the director of the Michigan Department of Natural Resources, who is responsible for water quality in Michigan. And the second, duplicate of this petition drive was sent to Chicago, Illinois, to put on the desk of the regional administrator of U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And they said, we demand that you identify the source of this odor. And so they sent people down, and they did monitoring, they did studies, and what they concluded and what they did was they started eliminating things one by one, and they got to the river, and they measured. One of the first things they did was measure the oxygen concentration in this section of the river, and there was none. There was 0. They could not measure any oxygen in the river. In the absence of oxygen, something gets formed called hydrogen sulfide, and that is the smell of rotten eggs. So hydrogen sulfide was off-gassing out of the river, and it was wafting into the bedrooms of these homes, and that was the issue. And so, of course, they said, well, what's causing all this? Why don't we have any oxygen? There was so much raw sewage coming in to the river from these 168 combined sewer overflow points that it was just overwhelming the Rouge River. Second part of that tipping point is a man was recreating on one of the branches of the Rouge River. And in the Rouge River, it's more like a stream in many places, and it's not very deep. So he slipped on the bank. He was picnicking with his family, slipped on the bank, fell into the river, stood up. The water's waist deep. He got wet. He crawled out, and no big deal, right? He dried off, and he finished his picnic. He went home that night. The next day, he started feeling ill. A couple of days after that, he passed away from leptospirosis, which is rat fever. the governments, the counties said, well, there's no real proof that this one man's death could be attributed to the raw sewage coming in from these 168 combined sewer overflow points. The health departments had no recourse but to issue a public advisory saying no human contact with the Rouge River. Can you imagine that? Advising people going out, no human contact with the river. These two things, the odor problem that was manifested in Dearborn and Melvindale, and one man's death from leptospirosis, were the tipping point. And all 48 communities in the watershed had to come together and work together on a plan, the Rouge River Remedial Action Plan, to help clean up the Rouge. There was a study done during the mid-1980s that was critical to this as well. And it was done by Wayne State University, Department of Chemical Engineering, and they did a study on the quantity and quality of combined sewer overflows in the Rouge River. And they did some modeling and monitoring, and it showed, everyone pointed the finger down at Detroit because that's where the wastewater treatment plant, Detroit had the most people. So Detroit needs to clean up its act first. But this study of the quantity and quality of combined sewer overflows in the Rouge River showed that if Detroit cleaned up its act in terms of combined sewer overflows, there would be no measurable improvement in the quality of the Rouge River. This study showed that it would take everyone doing their part. So all 48 communities, again, had to work together. At the time, there was some of you will remember his name, Jim Murray. He had grown up in one of the branches in Western Wayne County on the banks of the Rouge, fell in love with it, and went on and became the drain commissioner of Washtenaw County. But there's a portion of the Rouge River that is in Washtenaw County. So he championed it, and he rose to become the chairman of the Michigan Water Resources Commission. So he had some clout. They were responsible for issuing permits, for making things happen. So he took it on himself, and he championed bringing all 48 communities together. So he went on to create the Rouge River Basin Committee, which included all 48 mayors, and championed watershed-wide efforts. And in the language of today, we need boundary spanners or boundary organization networks. These are organizations or coalitions or individuals that work beyond disciplinary boundaries, work beyond political boundaries, work beyond geographical boundaries to cooperate, collaborate, and reach common goals. And so for the Rouge River watershed, what that boundary organization network looks like is the counties, US EPA, Michigan Eagle and DNR, Friends of the Rouge, Alliance of Rouge Communities, Rouge River Advisory Council, all 48 communities, NGOs, industries, schools, all working together on the Rouge River. So now the Rouge River is the first watershed in the United States, the very first where all communities have a stormwater permit. And so they have a National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit, a federal permit sanctioned by the state to address stormwater. And that think about this, coordinate sub-watershed planning. How does that work to get a watershed approach? They do the monitoring together, they do green infrastructure, and they have education and outreach. And the mechanism for collaborating on that is called the Alliance of Rouge Communities. So if we look at this from a historical perspective, the 70s and 80s were about pollution prevention and control. You know, think of what governments could do in issuing permits to municipalities for their wastewater treatment plants and to industries to control their pollution. So permitting to control pollution from what they call point sources. Then from 85 through present, we have this emphasis on addressing combined sewer overflows and stormwater, and they've reduced those CSOs from 168 down to 34. So that's measurable progress. And during this time, they have spent over $1 billion with a B on over 380 projects. You can imagine having a big chunk of the arsenal of democracy at the lower end of the Rouge River, you know, and over 100 or more years, the amount of contaminants that were discharged into the river and settled out in the sediments. Some of them got removed and put into the Point Mouillet confined disposal facility and navigational dredging, but a lot of them stayed. So there's been a couple of projects that have happened in the Rouge River to clean up contaminated sediments, and they've removed about 400,000 cubic meters at a cost of about $63 million. But we still have more to do. We still have 345,000 cubic meters that have to be addressed, have to be remediated in the lower Rouge. The good news is that 65% of the cost, and you know the last remaining sediment that needs to be cleaned up is going to be much more expensive than the earlier ones. The earlier ones were relatively easy compared to these. So, but 65% of the cost of this will come from the federal government through the Great Lakes Legacy Act. But they want communities, states, counties, industries to have skin in the game. So there has to be 35% non-federal match. Our challenge right now is to come up with that. And there's a work underway to work with Ford Motor Company, DTE Energy, Marathon, and others to help make that match. But it's cities don't have that kind of money. Counties don't have that kind of money, but the state could help. And so we're really trying to see if the state can play a role in this. And if you go to other states like New York, Minnesota, Wisconsin, the state has played a role. So we do have a path forward. We just have to implement it. There's also been lots of habitat rehabilitation and enhancement. Here's the picture of the Danvers Pond Dam, and they restored 91 meters of shoreline habitat. Here's an example of the oxbow. One of the oxbows in Dearborn was actually filled in. And so they have recreated this 671 meter oxbow in the river, and it's already paying dividends for the Rouge River. They removed the Wayne Road Dam and restored habitat there. And then this picture shows a fishway, a 173 meter fishway at the Henry Ford estate, and essentially Fairlane Mansion. So lots of good habitat work underway, already done and underway in the Rouge. So what's happened? How does that lead to revival? Cleanup has led to improved water, sediment, and biological quality, but we're not done. We've eliminated those obnoxious odors of the mid-1980s. We've remediated Newburgh Lake, both the sediments in there with high concentrations of PCBs, and that led to the lifting of some health advisories on certain species, which is good news, but we have more to do. We've seen improved dissolved oxygen in the river and elimination of those frequent fish kills due to no oxygen in the river that were commonplace in the 1980s. And we've seen some limited recovery of the invertebrates that live in the bottom sediments, and the fishery and a return of peregrine falcons near the mouth. This is just one station on the Rouge River. Military Avenue shows dissolved oxygen over time. This vertical axis is the percent of dissolved oxygen measurements that meet the state water quality standard of 5 milligrams per liter. And so you see the trend going up. That's what you need to know. There's lots of year-to-year variability, but overall, it's getting better. So on this figure, it shows that, 28% of the time in 1994, it met the 5 milligram per liter standard. Back in the mid 1980s, it might have been 10% or less. And now in more recent years, we're 70%, 70 to 90% or more in the Rouge River. So although we have accomplished a lot in the revival of the river, much more needs to be done to restore the physical, chemical, and biological integrity of this ecosystem that's called for in both the Clean Water Act in the United States and the Canada-US Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. So what are our remaining challenges? Think about this 300 and nearly 50,000 cubic meters of contaminated sediment that still remains in the lower Rouge River. We need to prevent pollution. It doesn't make sense to allow these pollutants, contaminants, toxic substances to still come into the river, because we could 10 years from now or 15 years from now be right back in the same place. So we need to prevent pollution, control contaminants at their source. So an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. We need to address urban sprawl, and urban sprawl is alive and well in the Rouge River watershed. We need to eliminate the remaining 34 combined sewer overflow points. We need to reduce that impervious surface within the watershed from 23 to 10%. We need to remediate those 345,000 cubic meters of contaminated sediment. We have more to do in terms of rehabilitating and conserving habitats and biodiversity. And of course, climate change is the compelling challenge of our time. Scientists call climate change a threat multiplier because it makes increasing intensity and frequency of storms makes it more difficult to solve stormwater problems, to deal with habitat restoration, to deal with contaminated sediments, to address some of the human health issues that are associated with it. And finally, I put on this list civic engagement that leads to a stewardship ethic. We need people involved in their river to think of this river as part of their home. They need to see themselves living in this home, and what we do to that home, we do to ourselves. So we need them involved. Leading the charge and reconnecting people to this watershed is Friends of the Rouge. They've been doing it for 37 years, and starting with a Rouge River rescue in 1986. Here's some of the pictures from Friends of the Rouge, but one of the great examples is the Rouge Education Project. It started with school kids, all high schools, monitoring the quality of the Rouge River, the water quality. So they would collect water samples. They purchased these hawk kits, which could measure 10 different parameters of water quality. Then they would take the data from the 10 different measurements they made, and they would calculate a water quality index. And one of the most vivid memories I have back during those days was one year, the high schools came in and sat down the Rouge River Basin Committee. Now, these are the mayors of all 48 communities then representatives from the counties and the state and federal governments. So the high school students are presenting to these decision makers, saying, and they lined up water bottles from the upper portion of the river down to the mouth, showing it being relatively clear in the headwaters and getting progressively more turbid, more brown, to almost looking chocolatey brown at the mouth of the river. Then they shared their data on the water quality index, showing how this was. It was such a compelling example to move governments to act, and students led the charge. Friends of the Rouge is also involved in lots of citizen science projects like bug hunts and frog and toad surveys and fishery monitoring. They're also now involved in, these building rain gardens, building green infrastructure, and we need much, much more of that in the future. They are also working with partners now to reconnect people to the Lower Rouge through a Lower Rouge River Water Trail, 23 miles. Who would think back to 1985 and the county health department saying, do not touch the Rouge River. No human should come in contact with the river. And here we are today, building the Lower Rouge Water Trail, building kayak launches and landings, doing interpretive panels, and reconnecting people to inspire a sense of wonder for the Rouge. There's also a great project called the Rouge River Gateway Project. That's a public-private partnership. It has communities, all the communities on the Lower Rouge. It has the Port Authority, it has DTE Energy, it has Levy Company, it has Ford Motor Company, it has Henry Ford Community College, U of M Dearborn, it's got Marathon in Wayne County, all trying not only to help with this Lower Rouge River Water Trail, but to build an interconnected set of greenway trails along there and interpret the amazing labor history that's here, the amazing First Nations history, the arsenal of democracy, and interpret natural resources in this area. What an amazing contribution that'll be in the future as well. So what we're doing is really changing the perception of the Rouge from that of a polluted river in the Rust Belt to an ecosystem that provides many ecosystem services and benefits, enhances quality of life, and supports close to home outdoor recreation for those 1.4 million people that call the watershed home. This is another one of my favorite photos of kayaking past the Rouge plant and one of the kayak trips of Friends of the Rouge. And this is my favorite quote for rivers, especially urban rivers. To deny the river is to deny the origin of the city. To rethink the river is to rediscover a unique opportunity to define urban places, join neighborhoods and communities together, and reconnect us to our landscape and our history. That's what we are doing. We are rethinking the Rouge River and rediscovering it as an urban place that can bring us together and that is part of our home. So I thank you very much, and I will be happy to answer some questions.
Yes, if anybody likes to unmute and ask a question, not comment, please. No, don't give comments, but ask questions, and maybe one question per person. Anyone like to go first here? I think you can all unmute yourself, correct?
I think so. This is
Okay.
Mike Hedge in Bingham Farms. What can people up in the Upper Rouge and Rouge branches be doing? How do we find out how much CSO is going on in our areas? And where can we get that kind of information?
There is a website that is sponsored by Michigan Eagle that identifies an up-to-date list where those last remaining CSOs are and which cities they reside in, and a little bit about where they are at in terms of addressing them. So that's one place you can learn immediately, but you can, in your community, you can advocate for stormwater controls. You can advocate for green infrastructure. You know, we need to do so much to address that 23% impervious surface. And we need examples of that that we can point to. You know, could it be a school that builds rain gardens? Could it be a church that does it? Can it, you know, you can, on your own house, you can put in rain barrels. You can make sure any new development in the watershed captures all the stormwater on site. Jerry mentioned that I was involved in the Detroit River International Wildlife Refuge, and we built the visitor center there on an old brownfield site. And it's called the Refuge Gateway, and it has a gold LEED certified visitor center. But in that, we had 44 acres, and we had to calculate how much stormwater on an annual basis would come onto that ground. And we had to create the green infrastructure, you know, bioswales, stormwater retention basins, to capture all of that and not make a situation worse. So you can advocate that in any new development to make sure there are proper stormwater controls. You also can work with schools to educate kids, to make sure they're involved. You know, this whole idea of the difference between environment and ecosystem is like the difference between house and home. House sits over there across the street. It's external and detached from us. But a home is something you see yourself in even when you're not there. And what we do to our ecosystem, then we do to ourselves. We need to be teaching this. We need to be teaching environmental protection and stewardship and all of these issues in schools. We can't miss that opportunity of inspiring and educating the next generation.
Okay, what was the website you referred to initially?
I can't give you Michigan Eagle. If you were to just do a search on Michigan Eagle, Rouge River Watershed, combined sewer overflows, you should be able to find it that way.
Okay. Now, is there much damage or negative contribution made by these branches of the Rouge that are jammed so they don't flow because they're jammed up with tree branches and roots and stumps? And because we live, and there's probably a half a dozen people on this call from this subdivision. We have 191 homes here, and one of the branches runs through here. And Tom Gorman, who is on this call, is sort of head of our nature trail maintenance group. But these last two heavy rainstorms we've had have really overwhelmed it. Mm-hmm. And we live immediately adjacent to a 13-mile road and just 1,000 feet east of Telegraph, where the Rouge comes under the 13-mile road, cuts through all the way through our subdivision and runs on down toward 12-mile. We really enjoy that part of the watershed. It's been an invaluable, you know, we've constructed nature trails. We've spent money on wood chips to wood chip the trail all the way around. We got 2 bridges, but there are 2 huge log jams, one of which damaged the first bridge across as a result of this previous rain, and another one that's been there for quite some time. And I know that getting heavy equipment down there would be very difficult. In fact, in the 70s, I started my career with the city of Southfield. Okay. And we did one of the first Rouge River cleanups down there. And we did exactly what you referred to. We got lots of other people involved. We laid on the contractors to Southfield to donate and operate heavy equipment for us for nothing for an entire weekend. We hauled out so much debris. We had these double tandem dump trucks we were loading up, and It was
Mike,
really did.
Mike, I
Yeah,
think a lot of others probably have a question. I think John understands the question if he can answer it. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, thank you for being a leader on that. I think, like, as you probably know, you don't have to remove all those logs, you have to free up the log jam, but you
Right.
can move those logs and create some habitat and increase the flow. And that will, short answer would be, in certain areas, you won't be doing damage from too much water, and you would keep the flow of the river going. That's not the glamorous stuff, but that's really important. And if you can get businesses, service clubs, if you can get governments to do a little bit, it's a big partnership that has to be done. And that's going to be a challenge in the Rouge for many years to come, especially with increasing intensity and frequency of storms from climate change. So we need more of those kinds of efforts. And it's like you said, it's a partnership.
Thank you.
And we have someone from the Southeast Michigan group who does this all the time. And we can give you, if you put your email in the chat, I can send you his name and you can talk to him about all that logjam stuff.
Great, thank
Let's
you.
go on. Yeah, another question? Anyone? John, I have one. You know that concrete part of the Rouge River that they put in? Is there any
Yeah.
chance they're going to take the concrete out?
Oh my goodness. Wouldn't we love that, Jerry? I mean, I can't believe I kind of, as a kid, I watched that go in, and, over 4 miles of concrete, that's no small project. So, in there are plans in place to take portions of it out. And, like, think about if you were a fish and you want to swim up and down the Rouge River, and you've got to go through a 4-mile stretch. There's no place to rest. There's no plants that are giving off oxygen or anything like that. So if they could create some small backwaters in there where fish can rest and stuff, sort of like pocket wetlands and resting areas. So they are looking at doing that. Both the Rouge River Advisory Council and Friends of the Rouge and others and the Corps of Engineers are looking at that right now. Will we take it all out in the near term? No, it's just too much. But can we make some incremental habitat improvements in it? Yes. And the mechanism to do that is now through the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative that we still have money in.
Thank you. Anyone else? You can unmute yourself. Oh, yeah.
Yes. Hi, John. I didn't hear you mention Fortsum Island. Isn't that another island that was man-made?
Yeah, Fortson is in the Lower Rouge, and it had some industry on there, but there's several owners out there right now. But the long term, wouldn't it be great if that could be cleaned up to the point where it could be a park, right? And have habitat out there. And so I think that's the direction of it. But the ownership is complicated right now, but they need to overcome that. But I know there's a number of the NGOs are interested in kind of protecting that for habitat. Maybe there could be a walking bridge or something over to it. But you'd have to deal with some legacy pollutants, almost like some brownfield areas out there as well. But I think that would be wonderful to be part of that Rouge River Gateway project.
All right, can I ask, I want to ask John if he had similar information about the Clinton River, or if not, if he knows of an individual similar to yourself that would be able to give us a program on that watershed.
Yeah, I would go to the Clinton River Watershed Council. They could do a really good big picture perspective and talk about, they've got their stormwater problems, right? They've got their raw sewage issues. They don't have the industry that the Rouge had, but they certainly have all of that. They have loss of habitat, they have invasive species. So I would go to the Clinton River Watershed Council, and I'm sure they would be most pleased to do a presentation on that.
Thank you.
John, hi, can you hear me?
Yes. Hi.
Hi, this is Gary. This is Gary Schrock. You and I have followed each other on LinkedIn for a while.
Yeah. Hi.
Yeah. Hi. I have a question about, you've talked about the high school students and things of that nature. Are you aware of any college programs that are currently involved in any kind of actions or studies on any of the Rouge branches at this point? Like not just U of M Dearborn, but possibly Wayne State or Oakland or any of the other communities that might be impacted by that.
Yes, there are students and faculty from University of Michigan Dearborn that are involved in different projects on invasive species and green infrastructure, and some projects on using GIS, Gary, and so sort of mapping out things. So and the Environmental Interpretive Center, which is part of U of M Dearborn, wants to get more involved in that as well and get more involved. We also have Cranbrook Institute that is interested. Obviously, they're in the watershed and they want to be a player as well, and other universities, but I think the most heavily involved is U of M Dearborn.
Okay, thanks.
We welcome any more questions. John, I have one for you then. I went to the Lower Huron Metro Parks, and I went there because I thought I was going to go swimming with my granddaughters, and turned out that I guess that's everything that's coming out of Ann Arbor, Ypsilanti then, is in that section of the river. And so since this stuff all connects with the Rouge River, are you also trying to get the people above that map that you showed to clean up?
Yeah, you definitely, there's a strong Huron River Watershed Council. We need this kind of grassroots ecological democracy by watershed. We need all of them. We need them even for someone as small as Ecorse Creek watershed. We need to have that. And who is that? Who can bring people together? Who is that boundary spanner, that boundary organization network that can bring herd cats and bring them together to cooperate and co-produce knowledge and co-innovate solutions and implement things, and then get students involved too. So we need a whole grassroots effort to do this, and I think this last major storm we had, I think many of you read the same articles I did, but you remember right at the end of the storm, the health departments came out and said, well, no contact with these rivers right now. There were too much raw sewage had come in, and they didn't have a handle on how much was coming in. So they issued this health advisory on no contact with these waters for 48 to 72 hours. So we've got our work to cut out, and under the climate change scenario, it's gonna become more challenging,
Any more questions from anyone? Okay, we have recorded this tonight, and we should have it up on our YouTube page within the week. So if you missed it, you can come back and take a look at it. So I just want to remind you that a month from today, which is the 5th of October, we're going to have Christy McGilvery and Tim Minotis, 2 employees from the Sierra Club, and they will be giving us a legislative update as a prelude to the November 7th election. Are there any other questions? If not, we want to thank John. Everyone, let's give him a hand here in the air. And thank you very much. And it was a wonderful presentation. And if you let me know on the next times you're going to get talks, I'll make sure that we send that information on, John.
Great. Thanks so
Okay.
much, Jerry. And thank you everyone for all you do. You're so important to passing on these resources in better shape to the next generation. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night.